Our guest, who just arrived yesterday from the East Coast, from New York, Elizabeth Hutchinson, is an associate professor of art history at Barnard College of Columbia University. She works closely with Barnard's American Studies program and Columbia Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race. Professor Hutchinson's research has recently centered on the role of photography in documenting and defining the topographical and cultural landscape of the West in the 19th century, and exploring the material properties of photographs from an ecological perspective. We're looking forward to this talk and ask you in joining me to welcome Professor Hutchinson.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. I'm really grateful for the invitation to speak to you today, to be here in beautiful Provo as an uninvited guest in Utah, homeland to the Ute, Paiute, and Shoshone peoples. In my chapter in the catalog, I was trying to think through ways to decenter dominant ways of approaching early photography of the American West, which have historically focused on American expansion and the heroic activity of photographers. I'll touch on those, but what I focus on here is how we might see photography as an interaction between human beings and the non-human material world. I'm centering this discussion on photographs by American and Norwegian photographers at Yellowstone, because this is a place that by its very nature invites human interaction with landscape features. I imagine a lot of you know what I mean. How many of you have been to Yellowstone? So did you find yourself leaning in to feel the steam from a hot springs on your body, or jump away to avoid the stream of a geyser, or leap with delight or maybe disgust when a mud pot issued a sulfurous burp? I'm sure the visitors among us followed all the rules, but some may have been tempted to take home a shard of obsidian or a clump of sinter, and you don't, because it's illegal and just not right. You're not like these people. And it's interesting to be giving this talk after the worst of COVID, because Yellowstone's visiting numbers skyrocketed in the last 2 years, setting new records in the past 2 years, but also the arrests of people in Yellowstone have risen in the last 2 years in addition. No Norwegians arrested, I don't think. Anyway, this paper is for you guys to know that you're not alone. In what follows, let me go back to this one. I consider photographers as early tourists to the region, and I take tourism at its heart as the human pursuit of encounters with material phenomena, cities, buildings, mountains, and rivers, etc., and propose that we understand photography in the same terms. This connection should not be surprising, for it is well known that one of the inventors of photography, William Henry Fox Talbot's early attempts to fix a shadow were in part in response to his interest in getting more accurate records of places seen in his travels. And in the 19th century, the ways in which photographic images were captured via light passing through a lens and activating chemicals suspended on the surface of a glass plate or paper negative inside the camera led some to meditate on whether photographs were the result of the actions of the photographer, his materials, or some combination of the two. Following Talbot, some described picture makers as mere camera operators, suggesting passivity, with the quote-unquote pencil of light responsible for bridging the world in front of the camera and that inside it. But of course, before, during, and after a picture was exposed, there were all sorts of things photographers needed to do, and we've been hearing about this already today. From transporting fragile, bulky equipment through all kinds of terrain, to preparing and fixing negatives, adjusting their chemistry and processes in response to the weather, the humidity, the temperature. Thus, my configuration does not so much see photography as a passive venture as it proposes it as an interactive one. And what does it mean to interact with Yellowstone? Yellowstone sits above a subterranean supervolcano that, though it hasn't erupted in millions of years, contains a deep reservoir of magma that is the cause of the hot springs, mud pots, and geysers for which the park is famous. Since the early exploration of Yellowstone in the 1870s, the area was deemed particularly inviting to human interaction due to these geothermal features. early visitors poked, prodded, and explored the landscape as a means of making sense of its unearthly qualities. Of course, there were no walkways and fences back then. Early photographers of this region, including Americans William Henry Jackson, Frank J. Haynes, and Norwegian Anders Bjørn Vilsa, not only recorded human engagements with these natural features, but they also interacted with them themselves in ways that are present in their negatives and prints. Photographers' material engagement with Yellowstone becomes clearer when we think about the challenges this landscape posed for them. 19th century photographers faced obstacles in documenting their experiences of Yellowstone, as it is a landscape that is both vibrantly colorful and constantly in motion. Technology of the time required long exposure times that rendered motion as a blur and restricted pictures to monochromatic tones. Thus, when F.J. Haynes wanted to capture the eruption of Old Faithful, the cone geysers whose predictable eruption made it a favorite feature of the park, he faced limitations. His picture records the impressive height of the geyser. Eruptions can reach 185 feet or 56 meters, but the dramatic contrast between the white steaming water and the blue sky is lost in this albumin print, and the shape of the plume is blurred to a blurred approximation that does not reproduce the experience of seeing it shift in response to changes in water pressure and wind. Haynes made a number of exposures of Old Faithful over the years, as did William Henry Jackson, the first to photograph the geyser. Scanning a range of Old Faithful pictures gives the viewer a better impression of the range of shapes traced by the spewing water during a several-minute eruption, but it also reinforces the sense of challenge posed by this subject. Visiting Yellowstone not much after Haynes and Jackson, Vilsa found a way to meet one challenge of capturing Old Faithful. He used his negative to produce a lantern slide, which he then hand-colored to bring out the chromatic drama of an eruption. Vilsa also chose to bring the viewer closer to the plume, as if to invite participation in the experience of being showered with vapor. But this other Vilsa slide of Old Faithful between eruptions reminds us that the scene captured in the other view represents just one ephemeral experience of an ever-changing landscape, and the guy in the front looks kind of disappointed that he was a little late to the show. Vilsa spent just a short time in Yellowstone, passing through as part of a federal survey party tasked with mapping uncharted areas of Montana and Idaho. His pictures of the park aren't much different from Jackson's and Haynes. Perhaps Vilsa's experience working as a surveyor for the railroads in the American West in the years before he became what he called a scenic photographer had grounded him in the scientific and aesthetic concerns of American viewers. Though employed by the survey, he held on to his negatives, understanding that there would be a public as well as governmental interest in his photographs. His sustained attention to Old Faithful illustrates his pursuit of a picture that lives up to the geyser's spectacular character for sale to armchair tourists in the US and later in Norway. Like Vilsa, Haynes created his images for an employer. He was the official photographer for the Northern Pacific Railroad, which was invested in luring tourists to travel to the region on its trains and which used his photographs in its promotional materials. Haynes's first trip to Yellowstone was in 1881, and over the years he worked for the park as well as the railroad, but like Vilsa and Jackson, he also sold his pictures directly to the public, making them available in a range of sizes and formats, from modest stereo cards to mammoth prints, like some of the ones you see in the exhibition. None of these photographs of Old Faithful offer a perfect record of what the geyser is like. Rather, they present records that are fully structured by how the photographer, the photographic apparatus, and the geyser worked together. These pictures support feminist physicist and theorist Karen Barad's argument that nature does not so much exist outside of and before our acts of measuring and representing it, but rather our apparatuses of representation, quote, actively reconfigure the world in its becoming. Simply put, human recording practices, quote, play a role in producing the very phenomena they set out to describe. 19th century photographers, who often arrived early to what became popular tourist destinations, certainly contributed to those sites' production. Yellowstone pictures thus offer privileged insight into the interactivity of people, technology, and nature in the process of creating this tourist site, creating legacies we still live with. Interaction is not only an aspect of the making of early Yellowstone photographs, it is also the subject of many of them. People appear throughout Haynes, Jackson, and Vilsa's pictures. While Old Faithful changes from image to image, the reaction of the figures included in these shots does not. Posed close to the geyser crater, offering an index against which to measure the plume's height, human bodies, single men or pairs, or sometimes a small mixed-gender crowd, give the viewer a model of curiosity, drawing one nearer to observe and comprehend the geological wonder. This is not unusual in Western American photographs of the time. As Elizabeth Childs and others have noted, including people who are examining the landscape within photographs of novel landscapes, brings in a, quote, self-consciousness of affect and presence that places the scene within the framework of human experience. In the Old Faithful pictures, photography's ability to stop time plays a role in our response to the picture, for as the bodies are frozen, a moment of observation is often transformed into a pose of silent, still awe, which we are encouraged to emulate. The photographer's characterization of Yellowstone as needing to be seen and interacted with to be understood was essential to the successful promoting of Yellowstone to become the nation's first national park, and subsequently to become a premier tourist attraction. Native peoples who dwelled in and around Yellowstone, including the Crow, Blackfeet, Flathead, Bannock, Nez Perce, Sheep-Eater, and Shoshone, have stories of interaction with the park's geothermal features that reach back thousands of years, but settlers had only formally begun documenting the area in the 1860s and 1870s because early reports of its hellish nature had kept them away. Information about Yellowstone's wonders reached national audiences before accurate pictures did. In 1871, Nathaniel P. Langford, who had been part of an 1870 expedition to the area, published a two-part article in Scribner's Monthly magazine that served to shape the nation's impression of Yellowstone. He begins by connecting Yellowstone with the romance of the Old West, something he was invested in as an early promoter of settlement of Montana, noting, quote, the skepticism with which the oft-repeated stories of the wonders of Upper Yellowstone were received. The travelogues traces the explorers' affective responses to the landscape features they encountered. Rock formations which excited merriment, hot springs which looked like nothing earthly we had ever seen, and waterfalls of grandeur never witnessed by mortal eyes. Again, erasure, right? Later, he identifies their journey as a search for new wonders. Langford introduced the American public to Old Faithful, which was named by members of the expedition party in similar terms. And so I'm just giving you a sense of this awful response. But the drawings are made by Thomas Moran, who had never been to the West and was merely using the descriptions, which is why these may not look like the features that you saw on your vacation. Judge then what must have been our astonishment as we entered the basin at mid-afternoon of our second day's travel to see in the clear sunlight at no great distance an immense volume of clear, sparkling water projected into the air to the height of 125 feet. The accompanying illustrations reinforce this emphasis on human encounter and response to the landscape by placing figures in nearly every scene, leaning back in wonder, pointing at a curious feature, or even, as in this one, breaking off a piece of the mineral deposits at the edge of a hot spring. When Ferdinand Hayden undertook a more official exploration of Yellowstone in 1871, his reports included illustrations that repeated both the wonderful rhetorical framing of the area and this active human engagement with the landscape. Many of these images were made by Jackson, who had been sought out for the job. Hayden led one of the federally funded geological surveys of the American West in the decade after the American Civil War, having been appointed the geologist in charge of the United States Geological and Geographical Survey of the Territories in 1867. Each of the four Western surveys of the time, the main ones, had photographers on staff. As several scholars have pointed out, photographers are not so much tasked with supporting the scientific research of the surveys, but rather were understood as essential to the promotional work that facilitated the reauthorization of these large-scale expeditions and helped build public support for the projects that grew out of them. Jackson's photographs also played a vital role in convincing Congress to withdraw the Yellowstone from the public auction of Western lands. On March 1st, 1872, President Ulysses S. Grant signed the act to set apart a certain tract of land lying near the headwaters of the Yellowstone River as a public park, a pleasuring ground for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. Attention to Jackson's practices as Hayden's photographer, recorded in his daybooks and his memoir, supports Barad's assertion that humans produce the phenomena they analyze through their interaction and their own activity, their recording or measurement apparatuses, and nature. We can see Jackson's 3 cameras in this light. He took 3 cameras with him, a stereo and 2 larger format cameras of various sizes. Jackson's other supplies included the portable darkroom, this picture is actually in the show, you can see, but we've been looking again at portable darkrooms all day, so he had one too. The portable darkroom, completely rebuilt and improved, a full stock of chemicals, and enough glass for 400 plates. All of this weighed an estimated 300 pounds, or almost 140 kilos. And so we really should see another non-human co-producer of the photographs in the mule named Hypo. His name is named after hyposulfate of soda, an essential compound used to fix images on the negative, who carried all of this stuff. Marshalling these forces took a while. The chemistry usually needed at least 5 seconds to undergo the changes necessary to make a negative. This is after it's loaded into the camera. But getting to the point of exposure required other negotiations with equipment and landscape as he set up and focused a shot, prepared a wet plate in the darkroom tent, transported it to the camera, brought it back after the exposure, and fixed it in a chemical bath. And this was especially challenging when he placed the camera in a small or precarious place and needed to locate the darkroom on safer ground some distance away. And that's what's going on in this picture. He actually took the shot of these 3 peaks all the way up here, but he had to put his darkroom somewhat out of the wind. And of course, it was also, had to change all kinds of things with his chemistry depending on not only windiness, but the temperature. So things tended to harden and solidify much more quickly in windy or cold weather. Sometimes he would heat up a shovel over the fire to add some warmth inside the darkroom so that the chemistry would continue to flow. Yes. Adjusting to the natural environment involved more than moving his equipment across challenging terrain. For volatile natural features, like the ones in Yellowstone, the photographer needed to try to coordinate the preparation of a camera and plate with an eruption. Being out in bright sun or high wind required adjustments in exposure length. Humidity levels demanded modification of time allowed between coating and fixing a negative, and proximity to sulfurous vapors could necessitate changes in the chemical solutions used in the darkroom. A review of photographic publications of the 1870s reminds us that early photographers, especially those who worked outdoors, were experimenters. The pages of the Philadelphia Photographer, the publication of the Philadelphia Photographic Society, regularly included correspondence from members offering their own formulas for collodion, the syrupy solution used for helping sensitized silver salts adhere to wet plate negatives, tricks for getting good exposures in all kinds of weather, and dodges to escape the setbacks presented by using impure water. In many ways, landscape photographers interacted with 2 environments, the one in front of the camera and the one on the glass plate negative. So significantly, terms derived from descriptions of the natural world were also used to describe problems in chemistry, development, and printing. Too much nitric acid created fog, and one problem with a silver bath resulted in the formation of what were called miniature volcanoes on the surface of the negative. Interestingly, the Yellowstone environment served as an asset as well as an obstacle for Jackson. This was particularly true at Mammoth Hot Springs, situated where the Gardner River descends down a slope at the northern end of what is now Yellowstone National Park. This unique landscape was created over centuries as hot water dissolved the travertine hillside and left deposits that formed bases arranged in staged terraces, giving the appearance of a massive fountain. And this is not in the show, but there is another photograph of Mammoth Hot Springs that you can go check out. These basins vary widely in depth, temperature, and chemical compositions. Many of the springs that feed into the river here contain minerals and cyanobacteria that give individual pools colors ranging from pale yellows and pinks to dark orange, something Vilsa recreated in his lantern slide of the location. In his 1872 article, Hayden described these colors. The deposit is as white as snow, except when tinged here and there. Channels lined with oxide of orange, colored with the most delicate tints of red. Others presented the most exquisite shades of yellow, from a deep bright sulfur to a dainty cream color. Jackson spent 3 days at these hot springs, making many exposures and sketches. And as he put it, the subject matter close at hand was so rich and abundant that it was necessary to move my dark box only 3 or 4 times. Another appeal of this location was that the time needed for the work was cut, because he made use of the springs in his practice. By washing the plates in water that issued from the springs at 160 degrees Fahrenheit, he wrote, we were able to cut the drying time more than half. The water in the hot springs was probably no more impure than that the photographers of the time pulled from the wells and metal pipes at home. And indeed, the chemical compounds in the waters of Yellowstone might have benefited pictures. The terraces of Mammoth Hot Springs are formed from calcium carbonate, which some photographers were using in their toning baths. Nearby Soda Butte Creek is rich with cadmium, a key ingredient in collodion. The iron and copper sulfate that thread through Yellowstone geology sometimes appeared in 19th century formulas for developer. Without suggesting that Jackson had full command of how the waters of Yellowstone would impact his pictures, his decision to dunk his negatives in them made the natural environment necessarily a part of the pictures themselves. And perhaps Jackson was inspired in dipping his negatives by the invalids who Hayden described frequenting these hot springs seeking cures by drinking or soaking in them. So again, an erasure when we see these pictures of the locals who came to cure themselves by having a hot bath. Certainly, Jackson's photographs show his fellow expedition members engaging actively with the springs, clambering up the terrace landscape, and in this case, using a hammer to chip off a geological sample. The ways Yellowstone invites physical interaction is shown again and again in early photographs that include people, and these may have set the tone for the early tourists, who were often likely also amateur geologists, as many Americans kept their own naturalist collections at this time. As Rebecca Bedell has explained, geology reigned through much of the 19th century as America's most fashionable science. Between 1820 and 1870, men and women across the country avidly pursued an interest in this field. They pushed their way into crowded lecture halls to hear talks by prominent geologists. They bought geological textbooks. They scoured the countryside for specimens to fill their mineral cabinets. Bedell notes that there is a nationalist dimension of the American passion for geology, as the uniqueness of the American natural environment gave it a value that could compete in the minds of citizens with the cultural reputation of European countries. For many tourists and specimen hunters, a detailed understanding of geological science was less important than gaining passing familiarity with America's unique natural features. And perhaps this explains early visitor Langford's choice to single out the geysers of Yellowstone as the most remarkable feature in American scenery and physical history, for they are relatively rare. And as he explained, similar examples could be found in no other countries but Iceland and Tibet. Langford notes a number of important scientists and amateurs who had visited Iceland just to see the Great Geyser and the Strokr, 2 famous fountains, a fact that his readers probably knew, being geology buffs, due to the publication of popular books about such journeys, such as Charles S. Forbes' Iceland, its volcanoes, geysers, and glaciers. Langford also traces several theories in his article to explain the nature of geyser eruptions and the chemistry involved. So this is in Scribner's, a popular, mass-distributed magazine. And again, he says the geysers of Yellowstone offer an illustration of these processes upon a much greater scale than Europe. As I quoted before, Langford was one of the first to call Yellowstone a wonderland, indicating not just the scale of its landscape features, but also their unusual colors and behavior. The term wonderland to refer to Yellowstone has its roots in Lewis Carroll's use of the term to describe a fantastical and deeply irrational place, and many of the early photographs of Yellowstone show human interaction with the landscape in a way that shows them seemingly trying to make sense of features that challenge their expectations. The men in Vilsa's picture called Kogende Hul, or Boiling Hole, are stopped in their tracks. the one at the right holding his hand slightly out as he turns toward the source of the steam, perhaps feeling the vapors warm his skin. His pose recalls one visitor's rapture in encountering the pool of an inactive geyser. Here we stood, entranced, gazing into its funnel throat for perhaps 20 feet. Far down in its indigo depths, there would form a phantom, faint white cloud growing whiter and more defined as it floated up to the surface and discharged itself in ebullition. The author's use of words like throat and phantom show how visitors personified this landscape that they interacted with. Charles Dudley Warner did similarly when he described a mud pot as a creature with nausea, which perpetually vomited and swallowed its sick. He called it the most fascinatingly loathsome thing in the world. Yellowstone could also inspire delight. One visitor wrote that one feels quite inclined to laugh at the geothermal features. Some visitors caught fish in Yellowstone Lake and proceeded to cook them by swinging their bounty into a steaming spring at the edge of the lake, never taking their dinner off the hook. Others washed their clothing in geysers by throwing them into pools before an eruption and then retrieving them when they'd been boiled clean. Soaping souvenirs was another popular pastime. This involved placing articles of clothing or divisive items such as picture frames and bottles into hot springs for a few days and then retrieving them after they'd accrued a white crust of silica. We can imagine the photographers responding to this landscape with a similar sense of playfulness. Did Jackson experiment with several different hot springs to find the one that would work best for developing his plates? And did he find amusement as he did so? His diaries do not say. But again and again, early photographs of Yellowstone depict human beings engaging with the landscape, not just wandering through it, but climbing on it, jabbing at it, staring at it, and tossing things into it. Haynes's, Jackson's, and Vilsa's pictures bring to life the experience of encounters with new places that were central to the landscape tourism in the United States, Norway, and elsewhere in the 19th century. That the photographers pursued this kind of interaction as well as documented it helps bring out the truth of Karen Barad's and other scholars' insistence that the significance of our natural places is neither something given nor a human construct imposed upon the world. Rather, it is something co-produced by natural features, systems of representation, and individual image makers. Each place visited by the photographers in this exhibition has a unique story to tell, one that can only come to exist through the interactions that resulted in these photographs. And these pictures allow us to do more than learn about the tourism of the past. They challenge us to think about the very nature of our engagement with the material world. Thank you.